They bulldozed my bridge like it was a drug lab and not a handmade walkway to a peaceful fishing spot. And the woman behind it? The HOA president with the ego of a small nation and the charm of a parking ticket. She claimed it violated aesthetics, but what she really destroyed was a whole lot more than some planks and screws. See, that bridge wasn't just mine, and when it went down, so did something this entire community depended on. What came next, let's just say it wasn't in her little HOA handbook. Hit the comments and tell me what's the dumbest power trip you've seen an HOA go on. I'll wait. The whole mess started on what should have been a perfect Saturday morning in Montana. I was putting the finishing touches on my handmade wooden bridge, carefully carving my name into the final beam with my pocket knife. The smell of fresh cedar mixed with the mountain air and Moonstone Lake sparkled in the distance like something out of a postcard. My grandfather used to say that people don't really own land. We just hold it in trust for the next generation. Looking at that bridge being destroyed, I felt like I had failed in my promise to him. This bridge had been my pride and joy for the past 2 years, a simple wooden walkway that stretched from my backyard out over the water to a small platform where I could fish in peace. After burning out from forest trail work, this little cabin and my hand-built bridge had become my sanctuary. That's when Crystal Whitlow appeared like a storm cloud on a sunny day. She marched across my yard holding a bright pink violation notice, her perfectly styled blonde hair not moving an inch in the breeze, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Mr. Langley, according to HOA regulations, all wooden structures must be approved by the management board before construction." I looked up from my carving, taking in her pressed blazer and the way she held that paper like it was a weapon. "This bridge is built entirely on my private property. I don't need anyone's permission." Her smile turned cold as winter. "It ruins the aesthetic value of the entire area. Moonstone Lake must be kept to proper standards." Nancy Fisher used to call my bridge the most peaceful spot in the whole neighborhood, but apparently Crystal had different ideas about what constituted community beauty. Crystal's voice got sharper as she continued her lecture about community standards and property values, but I wasn't really listening anymore. I was watching her eyes, the way they narrowed when she looked at my bridge, like it personally offended her. "You have 72 hours to remove this structure, or you'll face fines of $500 per day." $500 a day? For a bridge on my own land that didn't hurt anyone? I gripped my carving knife tighter, feeling my teeth clench as she spoke in that commanding tone like she was addressing a disobedient child. I'm not the type of person who enjoys conflict, but when someone stands in front of the whole neighborhood and paints you as a threat, you can't just stay silent. I've lived peacefully here for 3 years, until you became president. She straightened her blazer and gave me a look that could freeze fire. "Mr. Langley will learn how to live in a civilized community," she said, turning on her heel and marching back toward the main road. But here's the thing about Crystal Whitlow that most people didn't know yet. She hadn't always been the queen of our little neighborhood. I'd done some digging after she first started causing problems, and it turned out she used to run the parent association at some school district, until she got caught bullying a young teacher so badly that the woman quit. The scandal cost Crystal her reputation and nearly her marriage, so she moved to Copper Hills Estates to start fresh. Unfortunately for all of us, she decided to rebuild her image by turning the HOA into her personal empire, where she could feel important and powerful again. Every perfectly manicured lawn, every approved paint color, every regulated mailbox height was another way for her to prove she was still somebody who mattered. The woman had turned our quiet community into her personal rehabilitation project. That evening, as I sat on my bridge watching the sunset paint the lake orange and gold, I thought about Crystal's ultimatum. 72 hours to destroy something I'd built with my own hands, something that brought me peace after years of stress and burnout. I remember the first day I'd laid that initial plank under a light spring snow. My hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, but my heart felt calm for the first time in years. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career maintaining trails that connected people to nature, and now I was being told to destroy the one connection that mattered most to me. I ran my fingers along the carved railings, feeling every groove and curve I'd shaped over countless evenings. This wasn't just a bridge, it was proof that I could still create something beautiful in a world that often felt chaotic and destructive. As darkness fell, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Crystal was back, standing at the edge of my property line with her phone, taking pictures of my bridge from multiple angles. She wasn't just documenting a violation, she was measuring distances, making notes in a small notebook, studying my bridge like a general planning an attack. She even walked around to different viewpoints, snapping photos from the shore, from the road, from every angle she could find. This wasn't about community standards anymore. This was personal, and she was preparing for war. The next morning, I woke up to find an official notice from the city building department tucked under my door. Someone had filed a complaint about illegal construction without permits. The city building inspector showed up bright and early Monday morning, clipboard in hand and a slightly apologetic expression on his face. He was a decent guy named Bob who'd been doing this job for 15 years, and he could tell the difference between a legitimate safety concern and a petty neighbor dispute. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Langley, but we got a complaint about unpermitted construction." I walked him out to my bridge, showed him the building permits I'd properly filed 2 years ago, and watched his shoulders relax as he checked everything off his list. "Everything looks good here. Whoever called this in didn't do their homework." But even as Bob packed up his clipboard and drove away, I knew Crystal wasn't done. A woman who'd photographed my bridge from 12 different angles wasn't going to give up after one failed attempt. Sure enough, that very afternoon I got a text from Mike Coleman, the only HOA board member who'd ever shown me any basic human decency. Mike was a straightforward electrician who'd lived in Copper Hills for 8 years, and he'd seen Crystal's transformation from concerned neighbor to power-hungry dictator firsthand. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight, 7 p.m. at the community center. Crystal's got some kind of presentation about your bridge." I thanked Mike for the heads up and spent the rest of the afternoon wondering what fresh hell Crystal had cooked up. The community center was a modest building that served as our unofficial town hall, complete with folding chairs and a projector that probably dated back to the Clinton administration. Walking into that meeting felt like entering a courtroom, where I was the defendant and Crystal was the prosecutor, judge, and jury all rolled into one. She'd set up her laptop and projector like she was delivering a corporate presentation, complete with slides and charts that would make a marketing executive proud. 8 board members sat in a semicircle, most of them looking uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge Crystal's authority. Crystal presented like she was pitching a resort development project, with photos of my bridge covered in bright red arrows and property value comparison charts. If you didn't know better, you'd think I was building some kind of wilderness shack in a national park. Crystal clicked through her presentation with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything in her life. Mike Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his seat and finally spoke up. "The bridge doesn't hurt anyone. Hell, it's prettier than half the plastic deck furniture some folks have in their backyards." You could feel the tension in the room spike as Crystal's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment. "We're not here to discuss other violations, Michael. We're addressing this specific threat to our community's standards." Crystal moved to her next slide, which showed property value comparisons and market analysis that looked impressive, but probably came from some real estate website's generic templates. Waterfront aesthetic violations can decrease surrounding property values by up to 15%. That represents thousands of dollars in lost equity for every homeowner in this community. The math was creative, I'll give her that, but the presentation itself was overkill for what should have been a simple neighbor dispute. Nancy Fisher, who lived 2 houses down from me, raised her hand tentatively. "What exactly are you proposing, Crystal?" The HOA president's smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds. "I'm proposing a reasonable compromise. Mr. Langley can keep his bridge, but it must be painted to match our approved color palette and conform to community aesthetic standards." That's when I finally spoke up, and my voice carried more edge than I'd intended. "I'm not painting natural cedar to look like plastic. That's not a compromise. That's vandalism. I'm not the type of person who likes confrontation, but when someone stands in front of the whole community and paints you as a threat to everyone's financial security, you can't just stay quiet." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Crystal closed her laptop slowly, like a chess player who'd just seen her opponent's next 3 moves. "I see. Mr. Langley refuses to respect community standards and chooses confrontation over cooperation." She gathered her papers with theatrical precision, each movement calculated for maximum dramatic effect. "Very well. If reasonable compromise is impossible, then we'll have to pursue more decisive action." Mike Coleman leaned forward in his chair. "What kind of decisive action?" Crystal's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "The kind that protects our community's interests, regardless of individual selfishness." As the meeting broke up, I caught Mike by the parking lot. He looked genuinely worried, which was unusual for a guy who'd rewired half the houses in the neighborhood and never met a problem he couldn't solve with the right tools. "Garrett, I've never seen her like this before. Usually she's content to send nasty letters and make people's lives miserable in small ways. But this thing with your bridge, it's like she's taken it personally." I thanked Mike for his support and drove home, but his words stuck with me. Crystal had indeed taken this personally, and that made her dangerous in ways I was only beginning to understand. The next morning brought a certified letter that made my coffee taste like ash. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, full of legal terminology designed to intimidate rather than inform, demanding the immediate removal of my unauthorized structure and threatening swift legal action if I didn't comply within 72 hours. The letterhead was expensive, the language was aggressive, and the message was clear. Crystal wasn't playing games anymore. She'd moved from neighborhood politics to legal warfare, and she expected me to fold under pressure like a cheap lawn chair. But what Crystal didn't understand was that some battles are worth fighting, especially when they're about more than just winning or losing. The legal threat letter sat on my kitchen table like a coiled snake, all fancy letterhead and threatening language that probably cost Crystal a small fortune to draft. Words like injunctive relief and property violation remediation were scattered throughout the text like legal landmines, designed to make me feel overwhelmed and outgunned. But what Crystal didn't know was that my years maintaining Forest Service trails had taught me a thing or two about property rights and land use regulations. I'd dealt with enough bureaucracy to know when someone was bluffing with borrowed authority, and this letter reeked of desperation wrapped in expensive legal paper. That afternoon, I pulled out the old property maps from when I bought the cabin, remembering my grandfather's words. If you want to live in peace, you better understand the ground you're standing on. And right there in those yellowed papers, I found something Crystal never expected. The exclusive lake access rights for the entire community belonged solely to my property. What Crystal didn't know was that she'd just declared war on the one person who controlled everyone's path to the water. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. While I was discovering this buried treasure in my property records, I decided to send Crystal a little message of my own. I walked out to my bridge and installed a small wooden sign that read, "Maintenance in progress, please do not disturb." It was a polite way of saying construction zone, but it had the added benefit of making people wonder what exactly was being maintained and why. Within hours, I started getting curious looks from neighbors walking their dogs, and I could see curtains twitching in windows as people tried to figure out what was happening at the lake access point they'd taken for granted for years. The psychological effect was immediate and amusing. Nancy Fisher stopped by that evening, ostensibly to borrow a cup of sugar, but really to fish for information about my sign. "Everything okay with your bridge, Garrett? That sign has people talking." I kept my expression neutral and just said, "Oh, just some routine maintenance, nothing to worry about." But I could see the wheels turning in her head, the dawning realization that something bigger might be at stake. She'd lived here for 5 years and had never thought twice about walking down to the lake whenever she wanted. The idea that access might not be guaranteed had never crossed her mind. That's when old Hank Morrison stopped by, the retired police officer who'd lived in Copper Hills longer than anyone except the original developers. Hank had seen enough neighborhood disputes to recognize the signs of escalating conflict, and he'd been watching Crystal's campaign against my bridge with the experienced eye of someone who understood how small problems could become big ones. He took one look at my maintenance in progress sign and just chuckled, shaking his head. "That bridge is the soul of this place, son. The little lady doesn't know what fire she's playing with." Hank had a way of cutting through nonsense with simple wisdom, and his words carried the weight of someone who'd seen plenty of power-hungry people overreach and fall. Crystal, meanwhile, was escalating her own tactics. Through Mike Coleman's network of contractor friends, word filtered back to me that she'd been making calls to local construction companies, asking about emergency repair services and unsafe structure removal. She was shopping for someone willing to tear down my bridge under the guise of public safety, probably planning to present it as a fait accompli at the next HOA meeting. The woman was nothing if not thorough in her scheming, but she was also digging herself deeper into a hole she didn't even know existed. Late that night, I sat at my kitchen table with the property surveys spread out in front of me, a cup of coffee growing cold as I traced boundary lines and easement descriptions with my finger. The original owner had been smarter than I'd given him credit for, negotiating exclusive lake access rights when the area was first developed. More importantly, every other potential access point to the lake had been declared off limits for environmental protection reasons. The state had classified the surrounding wetlands as protected habitat, which meant my bridge wasn't just a convenience, it was the only legal way for anyone in Copper Hills Estates to reach the water. The sound of machinery rumbled like hunting beasts in the night. Through my kitchen window, I could see Crystal directing her survey team like a general commanding a military campaign. My peaceful Saturday had just been replaced by a new battlefront. The next morning brought my answer, in the form of Nancy Fisher knocking on my door at 6 a.m., still in her bathrobe and looking genuinely alarmed. "Garrett, you need to see this. Crystal hired some company to do emergency infrastructure assessment around the lake area. They've got equipment and everything." As I watched Crystal coordinate her little army of contractors from my kitchen window, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about community standards or property values anymore. This was about power, control, and one woman's desperate need to prove she could bend an entire neighborhood to her will. She'd moved beyond negotiation, beyond legal intimidation, and straight into the realm of direct action. Fine. If Crystal wanted to play hardball, she was about to learn that some games have consequences she'd never considered. The machinery noises were getting closer, and I had a sinking feeling that my peaceful Saturday morning was about to become anything but peaceful. 5:30 in the morning is supposed to be peaceful in the mountains of Montana, especially on a Saturday when most sane people are still asleep. Instead, I woke up to the mechanical roar of a bulldozer that sounded like it was parked in my living room. I stumbled out of bed, threw on yesterday's clothes, and rushed outside to find my worst nightmare becoming reality. A crew of construction workers was systematically destroying my bridge, piece by carefully crafted piece, while Crystal Whitlow stood 20 feet away with her phone held high, recording every moment of my shock and devastation. The bulldozer operator was methodical in his destruction, starting with the support posts and working his way across the span I'd spent 8 months building by hand. Each piece of cedar that fell into the water represented hours of careful planning, measuring, cutting, and carving. Looking at every piece of wood falling into the lake, I couldn't help but remember the scenes from my old rescue work in the forests. How things you tend to every day can disappear in an instant. The decorative railings I'd shaped during quiet evenings, the platform where I'd watched dozens of sunsets, the small details that had made this bridge uniquely mine, all of it was being reduced to floating debris in a matter of minutes. "Stop!" I yelled, running toward the machinery. "You can't do this! This is my property!" But the operator either couldn't hear me over the engine noise or had been specifically instructed to ignore any protests. Crystal's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Emergency waterline maintenance, Mr. Langley. The city identified your structure as a potential hazard to underground utilities." She held up an official-looking work order, though from my distance I couldn't read the details. Sometimes these things happen on short notice. The way she said it, with that satisfied smile playing around her lips, made it crystal clear that nothing about this was accidental or emergency. This was calculated destruction, planned and executed with military precision while I slept. I remembered that first day I'd laid the initial plank, under a light spring snow. My hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, but my heart felt calm for the first time in years. Now all of that peace was being torn apart by someone else's need for control. I stood in the growing pile of wood debris, holding a piece of the nameplate I'd carved with my own hands, now split cleanly in half. 8 months of work, destroyed in 8 minutes. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional gut punch of watching something I'd created with love and patience get obliterated by someone else's petty power trip. My hands shook as I picked up splinters of cedar that still smelled like sawdust and mountain air, trying to process the reality that my sanctuary was gone. Looking at every piece of wood scattered in the water, I was reminded of the friends I'd lost during forest rescue operations, how the things we cherish can vanish without warning, leaving only memories and regret. Here's where Crystal made her first tactical error, though she didn't realize it at the time. While she was busy recording my emotional breakdown, her phone also picked up her voice as she directed the demolition crew. "Make sure you get the center section completely down first," she told the bulldozer operator. "We don't want any chance of someone trying to repair it. That little piece of audio evidence would prove very useful later, but in the moment I was too devastated to appreciate the gift she'd just handed me. All I could see was the destruction of something that had represented hope and healing in my life." Mike Coleman appeared at my shoulder like a guardian angel, his electrician's work truck still running in my driveway. "This is completely illegal, Garrett. There's no emergency water line work scheduled in this area." He'd been monitoring the county utility schedules as part of his business, and he knew damn well that Crystal's emergency maintenance story was pure fiction. "She's gone too far this time. This isn't about community standards anymore. This is about one woman's power trip." His words were comforting, but they couldn't undo the damage that was already done. The bridge that had connected me to peace was gone, and with it, any illusion that Crystal would stop at reasonable limits. As the demolition crew packed up their equipment and drove away, leaving behind nothing but scattered wood debris and churned up mud where my bridge used to be, Crystal approached me with fake sympathy dripping from her voice. "I'm sorry it had to come to this, Mr. Langley, but sometimes decisive action is necessary for the good of the community." She tucked her phone into her purse with the satisfied air of someone who just won a chess match. "Perhaps now you'll understand the importance of working within established guidelines." Then she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my peace project. But here's the thing about destroying someone's bridge. Sometimes you don't realize you've just cut off your own escape route. As I stood there among the floating pieces of cedar, watching Crystal's perfectly styled figure disappear down the road, a memory from my Forest Service days suddenly surfaced. Those property surveys I'd been studying, the easement rights I'd discovered, the environmental protections around Moonstone Lake. Crystal had just made the biggest mistake of her HOA presidency. She destroyed the only legal access point to the lake, effectively cutting off 47 families from the water they'd taken for granted. And since the easement belonged to my property, I was the only person who could authorize. The irony was so perfect, it almost made up for the heartbreak of losing my bridge. Almost. Crystal thought she'd won by destroying my connection to the lake, but what she'd actually done was hand me the keys to everyone else's connection. The morning after the bridge destruction, I sat at my kitchen table with property surveys, old Forest Service maps, and a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking together in ways that Crystal clearly hadn't anticipated. My years maintaining federal trail systems had taught me to read land use documents like other people read newspapers, and what I was seeing made me realize that Crystal had just committed the equivalent of burning down the only bridge out of town. The exclusive lake access easement attached to my property wasn't just a legal footnote, it was the key to everything. Crystal kept scrambling around like a chicken with its head cut off, thinking she could throw HOA money at the problem and fill in the hole she'd just dug for herself. All the other paths down to the lake were protected by environmental laws. No construction, no regular foot traffic allowed. Only my bridge had been the legal connection. Crystal thought she'd just won a victory, but she'd actually cut the rope that held the entire community together. I didn't yell, didn't seek loud revenge. I just put up a small sign and let people draw their own conclusions. Like my grandfather used to say, fools always make the most noise. Smart folks just stay quiet and wait for the right moment. I decided it was time to send the community a gentle reminder of what they'd lost. That afternoon, I walked out to where my bridge used to stand and erected a large wooden sign that read, "No bridge, no lake access," in bold black letters that could be seen from the main road. The message was simple, clear, and calculated to make people think about cause and effect. Within hours, neighbors were stopping their morning walks to stare at the sign, and I could see the dawning realization in their faces as they processed what it might mean for their own lake activities. The psychological pressure was immediate and exactly what I'd hoped for. Nancy Fisher was the first to approach me directly, arriving at my door that evening with worry lines creasing her forehead. "Garrett, what exactly does that sign mean? My kids have been swimming in that lake every summer for 5 years. I kept my expression neutral and sympathetic. "Well, Nancy, Crystal had my bridge destroyed because she said it was unauthorized. The thing is, that bridge was the only authorized way to get to the lake from our neighborhood. All the other paths cross protected wetland areas." I watched her face go pale as the implications sank in. "So you're saying we can't use the lake anymore?" I shrugged with the calm patience of someone who'd learned to let problems solve themselves. "I'm saying the legal access is gone, and I'm the only one who can authorize rebuilding it." Meanwhile, Crystal was continuing to dig herself deeper into the hole she'd created. Through Mike Coleman's network of local tradesmen, I learned that she'd hired an expensive landscaping company to begin improving the lake area. With new pathways and aesthetic enhancements, she was spending HOA money on beautification projects for an area that the community could no longer legally access. The irony was delicious, but I kept my amusement to myself and continued to let Crystal operate under the illusion that she'd won some kind of victory. Watching her throw good money after bad was like watching someone try to water a garden with a broken hose. All effort, no results. Crystal hired contractors to cut through protected environmental zones, like the conservation laws were suggestions, not actual regulations. I didn't say anything, just stood there and took a few pictures. Sometimes you just need to provide the rope. They'll tie the knot themselves. Every day she continued with her unauthorized improvements. She was creating more evidence that would come back to haunt her. Sometimes the best strategy is just giving your opponent enough rope to hang themselves with. By the end of the week, the psychological pressure was starting to show throughout the neighborhood. Parents were explaining to disappointed children why they couldn't go swimming anymore. Weekend fishing trips were canceled. The annual community barbecue that traditionally took place by the lake was quietly postponed. Nancy Fisher had started organizing informal meetings where neighbors shared their frustration about losing lake access, and Crystal's name was coming up more and more often in less than flattering contexts. The beautiful thing about truth is that it has a way of surfacing on its own. You don't have to force it. I spent those days preparing for the next phase of my counterattack, researching property law and consulting with a real estate attorney who specialized in easement disputes. The legal landscape was even more favorable than I'd initially realized. Not only did I have exclusive rights to authorize lake access, but Crystal's destruction of my bridge could be considered interference with a legal easement, potentially making her liable for damages and restoration costs. The attorney's exact words were music to my ears. You don't just have the right to deny access, you have the legal authority to demand compensation for the destroyed bridge and control any future access arrangements. The final piece of my strategy involved waiting for Crystal to overplay her hand, which I knew she would do because her personality wouldn't allow her to accept anything less than total victory. Mike Coleman had mentioned that she was planning a special HOA meeting to present her lake area improvement project and request additional funding for the beautification work. That meeting would be the perfect venue to reveal the legal reality she'd been ignoring. Crystal thought she was planning a victory celebration, but she was actually setting up her own public humiliation. As I sat on my back porch that Friday evening, looking out at the lake I could no longer reach and the community that had been cut off from their recreational haven, I felt a mixture of sadness and anticipation. Sadness for the bridge I'd lost and the peaceful evenings I'd spent fishing from its platform. Anticipation for the moment when Crystal would finally understand the consequences of her action. Like my grandfather always said, a bridge doesn't just connect land, it connects people. And when someone destroys that connection, they're the ones who end up stranded on the wrong side. The weekend was coming, and with it, the first real test of how long the community would tolerate being locked away from their lake. Monday's HOA meeting was going to be very interesting indeed. Monday evening's HOA meeting had the feel of a corporate presentation crossed with a town hall showdown. Crystal had reserved the community center's main room and set up her laptop and projector like she was delivering a quarterly earnings report to shareholders. 12 board members and concerned residents filled the folding chairs, creating an audience that was equal parts curious and frustrated. Crystal stood at the front of the room wearing her power suit and confident smile, completely unaware that she was about to experience the most public failure of her HOA presidency. Her presentation was a masterpiece of expensive delusion. Professional slides showcased rendered images of stone pathways, decorative benches, and landscaped gardens that would transform the Moonstone Lake area into something resembling a resort brochure. Phase 1 of our comprehensive lake area enhancement project, she announced with the authority of someone who'd never been wrong about anything, represents an investment of $180,000 in community beautification and property value improvement. The price tag drew gasps from the audience, but Crystal pressed on, undeterred. The return on this investment will be measurable in both increased home values and enhanced quality of life for all residents. I sat in the back row with my own folder of documents, watching Crystal dig herself deeper with every enthusiastic slide. She detailed walking paths that crossed protected wetlands, viewing areas that required permits she hadn't obtained, and improvement projects that assumed community access to land that was no longer legally available. Mike Coleman caught my eye and raised his eyebrows questioningly, but I just nodded toward the front of the room, where Crystal was describing amenities for a lake that her own actions had made inaccessible to the community. When Crystal finished her presentation and asked for questions, I stood up slowly and made my way to the front of the room. I have some information that might be relevant to this discussion. I opened my folder and spread out the property surveys, easement documents, and environmental protection maps on the table beside her laptop. When I unfolded those maps on the table, the entire room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop, and it would have been loud enough to make Mike frown. These are the legal documents that govern lake access for our community. Crystal's confident expression flickered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered her composure. I'm not sure how property boundaries relate to our improvement project, Mr. Langley. That's when I dropped the legal bombshell that Crystal had somehow failed to research, despite her elaborate planning. According to the original 1987 development agreement, my property holds the exclusive easement for lake access from Copper Hills Estates. The bridge you had destroyed last week was the only legal pathway to Moonstone Lake for anyone in this community. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife as 12 faces turned from me to Crystal and back again. Nancy Fisher was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you saying we can't use the lake anymore?" Crystal tried to maintain her authority, but I could see panic starting to creep into her eyes. That's ridiculous. The lake belongs to everyone. It's a community resource. I pulled out the environmental protection documents and spread them on the table. The lake itself is public water, but every access point except my property crosses protected wetland areas. The State Environmental Agency was very specific about prohibiting any construction or regular foot traffic through those zones. Mike Coleman leaned forward in his chair, studying the maps with the focused attention of someone who understood property disputes. "So you're saying Crystal just cut off our only legal way to get to the water?" That's when an elderly woman sitting in the back row spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of years and deep frustration. "I've been taking my grandson fishing every week for 3 years. You didn't just destroy a bridge, you destroyed our family tradition." Her words hit the room like a physical blow, and I could see several other residents nodding in agreement. The atmosphere shifted like air pressure before a thunderstorm, as 12 residents who'd been listening to Crystal's expensive beautification plans suddenly realized they were discussing improvements to an area they could no longer legally access. Crystal made one last desperate attempt to maintain control of the narrative. "This is clearly a misunderstanding. I'm sure we can work with the environmental agencies to establish proper access routes." But I was ready for that deflection too. I pulled out photographs of the landscaping work she'd authorized over the past week. "These pictures show the unauthorized pathway construction your landscaping crew has been doing through protected wetland areas. Every day they've been working represents additional environmental violations that will need to be remediated before any new access can even be considered." The meeting devolved into heated discussions as residents realized the full scope of what Crystal had done. She'd destroyed their lake access, spent their HOA fees on improvements to an area they couldn't use, and potentially created environmental violations that could result in fines and legal action against the entire community. Mike Coleman stood up and addressed the room with the calm authority of someone who'd spent years solving complex problems. "I think we need to have a serious discussion about leadership, accountability, and finding a path forward." That's when I delivered my ultimatum, spoken clearly enough for everyone to understand their options. "I can authorize the reconstruction of lake access, but it will require 3 things. First, the HOA will pay for rebuilding my bridge exactly as it was before. Second, Crystal Whitlow will resign as HOA president and issue a public apology for her actions. Third, any future lake area decisions will go through proper legal channels with full community input." The room erupted in discussions as residents weighed their options: accept my terms and regain their lake access, or support Crystal and remain permanently locked away from the water they'd taken for granted. Crystal's face had gone from confident pink to pale white as the reality of her situation finally sank in. She'd gambled everything on a power play that had exploded in her face, leaving her community angry, her authority shattered, and her legal position completely untenable. As residents filed out of the meeting to discuss their options privately, I could see in Crystal's eyes the dawning realization that she'd just handed me complete control over the one thing that mattered most to every family in Copper Hills Estates. The morning after the HOA meeting brought a steady stream of visitors to my front door, each one representing another crack in Crystal's rapidly crumbling authority. Nancy Fisher arrived first, followed by 3 other families with children who'd been counting on summer swimming sessions. By 10 a.m., I had 8 neighbors gathered in my living room, all of them asking the same basic question: what would it take to get their lake access back? The answer was simple, but Crystal was making it complicated by refusing to accept responsibility for the mess she'd created. While these conversations were happening at my house, Crystal was apparently making phone calls to lawyers, environmental agencies, and anyone else who might help her find a way out of the corner she'd painted herself into. But every avenue she explored led back to the same legal reality. I owned the only authorized lake access, she'd destroyed it without permission, and the community was stuck until we reached an agreement. Mike Coleman stopped by around noon with an update from his network of contractors and municipal contacts. She's tried calling the county, the state environmental office, and 3 different law firms. They all told her the same thing. You hold all the cards here. By Wednesday, the psychological pressure was showing throughout Copper Hills Estates. The community swimming pool had a waiting list for the first time in years as families sought alternative water recreation. Weekend fishing trips were being canceled or relocated to public access points 20 miles away. The annual 4th of July lakeside barbecue that had been a neighborhood tradition for 8 years was quietly postponed indefinitely. Crystal's beautification project continued despite its pointlessness, creating more evidence of her poor judgment, with every dollar spent on improvements to an inaccessible area. Thursday brought the breaking point in the form of a petition that Nancy Fisher had been quietly circulating. 11 of the 12 HOA board members had signed a document requesting Crystal's immediate resignation and authorizing negotiations with me for lake access restoration. The holdout was Crystal herself, who was apparently still hoping to find some legal loophole that would restore her authority and validate her destructive decision-making. But hope and reality were diverging rapidly in her world. That evening, Crystal finally swallowed her pride enough to knock on my door for a private conversation. Gone was the commanding presence and confident authority she'd displayed during our previous encounters. Instead, she looked like someone who'd spent sleepless nights coming to terms with the consequences of her actions. Mr. Langley, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the bridge situation. I invited her to sit on my back porch, where we could look out at the lake she'd made inaccessible to her own community. The only misunderstanding, Crystal, was your assumption that you could destroy my property without consequences. Crystal tried several different approaches during our conversation, ranging from attempted negotiation to barely concealed threats to outright pleading. She offered to have the HOA pay for bridge reconstruction if I would publicly support her leadership. She suggested that my misinterpretation of the easement documents was creating unnecessary conflict. She even hinted that my obstinate behavior might result in legal action against me, but every argument she made came back to the same fundamental problem. She'd destroyed the community's lake access, and I was the only person who could restore it. The conversation took an interesting turn when I pulled out my phone and played back the audio I'd extracted from her demolition day video. Her own voice, clear as a mountain stream, directing the bulldozer operator to get the center section completely down first and make sure there was no chance of someone trying to repair it. Crystal's face went through several color changes as she listened to evidence of her premeditated destruction of community infrastructure. That was taken out of context, she said weakly, but we both knew that context wasn't going to save her from the consequences of her recorded words. Friday morning brought the community meeting that would determine Crystal's fate and the future of lake access for Copper Hills Estates. This time, the gathering was held at Nancy Fisher's house, with 15 residents crowded into her living room to hear my final offer. The terms were straightforward and non-negotiable. Complete bridge reconstruction funded by HOA reserves, Crystal's resignation and public apology, and establishment of a community oversight committee for any future lake area decisions. The alternative was permanent loss of lake access and potential legal liability for environmental violations caused by Crystal's unauthorized landscaping project. The vote was as swift as it was decisive. 14 residents supported accepting my terms, with only Crystal herself opposed to the resolution. Mike Coleman was elected as interim HOA president, and within an hour of the vote, Crystal was drafting her resignation letter. The document was a masterpiece of political face-saving that acknowledged differences in community vision without admitting to any specific wrongdoing. But the important thing was that it was signed and effective immediately. Bridge reconstruction began the following Monday with a crew of local contractors who understood both the original design and the legal requirements for easement infrastructure. I supervised the work personally, ensuring that every detail matched my original construction while incorporating improvements suggested by the Community Oversight Committee. Nancy Fisher's kids were among the first to test the new bridge when it was completed 6 weeks later, their laughter echoing across Moonstone Lake like a celebration of restored community access. The final chapter of the Crystal Whitlow saga played out over the following months as she gradually withdrew from neighborhood social activities and community involvement. She still lived in Copper Hills Estates, but her days of commanding authority and imposing her vision on unwilling neighbors were permanently over. The experience had taught her and everyone else a valuable lesson about the difference between leadership and domination, between community improvement and personal power trips. As I sit here on my rebuilt bridge this evening, Watching the sunset paint Moonstone Lake in shades of gold and orange, I can hear the gentle creaking of wood under my feet and the sound of children's laughter carried on the mountain breeze. What Crystal tried to destroy was peace itself. But peace has a way of returning when people stand together. I'm reminded of something my grandfather used to tell me. A bridge doesn't just connect land, it connects people. And when someone tries to break that connection, they're the ones who end up stranded on the wrong side. Crystal thought that destroying my bridge would force me to submit to her authority, but she never considered that some actions have consequences that reach far beyond their intended targets. She wanted to control one man's access to the lake and ended up losing her own community's access instead. Sometimes the most powerful response to destruction isn't revenge, it's rebuilding what was lost, stronger than before. The new bridge carries more than just people to the water. It carries the lesson that when communities stand together against those who would divide them, they become unbreakable. Crystal learned that authority built on fear and control crumbles quickly, while leadership built on trust and respect endures. 3 months later, she moved away quietly, selling her house at a loss to escape the daily reminder of her failures. Mike Coleman continues to serve as our HOA president, focusing on bringing people together rather than tearing them apart. In the end, the bridge she destroyed wasn't just made of wood and nails. It was made of trust, respect, and the understanding that some things are too important to be sacrificed for petty power games.
QA Stories thanks you for hanging out today. Don't forget to binge a few more. Trust us, you'll be hooked.